Welcome to another episode of the Tour on Air podcast. My name is Niko, the founder of Tech Open Air, and today I'm joined by Francoise Baylis, professor of bioethicist, or one of the leading voices in the field. You also work at the intersection of applied ethics, health policy, and practice. And I'm really excited to learn more about it because this is certainly a field that we've had featured a few times. We had Dr. George Church on, for example, from Harvard University. But yeah, certainly hardly know anything about, so very interested to find out more. Thanks so much for joining today.
Well, thanks for inviting me to have a chat.
So the way that I thought we could maybe structure this conversation is, before we get into the kind of ethical implications and what you think we should be thinking of as a society, the differences maybe of approaches that we see in the United States, in Europe, and in China. Let's maybe talk about like, where are we at when we talk about gene technology breakthroughs, and give us maybe also a little bit of the sci-fi vision where we could be headed if we were to choose a path that allows for anything is possible.
Great. Well, so one of the areas in which I've been working for the past 5 or 6 years is human genome editing. And in that context, I've been looking at it both with regards to the possibility to manipulate what we call somatic cells. And those are just our body cells, your hair cells, your skin cells, your liver cells. But we also have the potential to manipulate our reproductive cells. And so that would be your gametes, your egg and sperm, the early embryo, even the precursors to the gametes. And that we refer to as heritable genome editing. And so I'm interested in both because they involve making changes to our DNA, which we think of as fundamental to ourselves, but not exclusively so. So I don't embrace determinism. We are not just our genes, but we do know that our genes have a huge impact on who we are and how we're able to navigate in this world. And so some of the questions I'm interested in is this project of possibly embracing the idea of taking over the human evolutionary story. What does that mean to say that we would actually attempt to control the genetics, not just of 1 or 2 individuals, but of large communities and possibly even the species? So if we really want to talk science fiction, it would be the idea that we would somehow design the next iteration of whatever Homo sapiens would turn into in some way, shape, or form, as opposed to, say, allowing Darwinian processes to take place. We have ideas, we have hopes, we have aspirations, and we would use those to take on a pretty significant design project. So that's sort of the big picture, and that's looking towards a future that's quite distant, but in the minds of many, not impossible.
And by Darwinian, you mean in this context that basically we would allow for those who can afford this type of technology to basically have, their children basically get even a better starting line than they already have?
Well, one of the things is that in the past, we would have thought that whatever evolution happens is a function of a changing environment. And then what happens is the gene accommodates in order to survive within that changing environment. It too has to change. And so that's how you get a story that takes us from some kinds of animals to other kinds of animals, ultimately leading up to Homo sapiens. I think what we're looking at now is the possibility that it would not just be this sort of gene environment interaction. It would more be that we would be bringing to this social drivers, if you will. And the social drivers will come in the form of those who have access to power, those who have access to money, those who have access to ideas, and they will represent a very small segment of society. And by and large, they will be the privileged amongst us. And so what I have written about and worried about is, what does it mean to allow people to take their privilege, their social, political capital, and in fact, move that into their DNA, so that now your advantage will not just be your social
Mhm.
advantage or your financial advantages, you will now also have a unique biological advantage. And that's because we typically tend to think about making these design projects with a view to competition
Mhm.
and ultimately coming out on top.
And can we, before we go further into the ethical implications of this, talk a little bit about, more specifically, like, what, like on a horizon maybe of like 30 years, you know, 30, 50 years maybe, what would be some of the things, and what can we already do now in certain countries like China, for example, where people talk about, designer babies, like, what are some of the, I guess, features, characteristics that we would be able to, improve or genetically modify in a way that our offspring, have a different starting point.
Right. So I think one of the things that's really important is to kind of start by grounding it in reality. And
Hmm.
one of the things that happened is in 2018, a group of Chinese scientists did in fact manipulate human embryos in a
Hmm.
dish and transferred, if you will, those genetically modified embryos to a woman who gave birth to twin girls. And those twin girls were supposedly modified in order to have resistance to HIV.
Hmm.
We also know that a third child has since been born, and we don't know very much about any of the children for a number of reasons, partly to do with, I think, some ethically defensible claims to
Hmm.
privacy and respect for these children, that they should not be sort of subject to, the microscope of the world for the rest of their lives. But it does also mean that we won't have information that is just medical or scientific to know whether or not these kinds of manipulations were successful or were in fact harmful, or however we would
Hmm.
understand them. So the starting point is to say we do in fact have genetically modified individuals walking amongst us. They are
Hmm.
few, and at the time the world responded in an extremely negative way. And I'm saying negative purposely, not just cautious, but
Hmm.
negative, that this was inappropriate. It should not have happened. Now, what's interesting is there's consensus on this view that it was inappropriate. It should not have happened. But after that, the consensus breaks down. And it breaks down because some people think it should never have happened and should never happen in the future. Other people argue, of course, it can and should happen in the future. It just shouldn't have happened now. Why not? Because at this point in time, it's not safe or effective. Now, to your question, what might we be doing in 30 years? I'm not convinced we'll be doing a whole lot more,
Hmm.
insofar as I think the issues of safety and efficacy are going to prove quite challenging for a variety of reasons. One of the things, though, that we may see happen within the next 30 years is that instead of trying to manipulate the human embryo, we will actually focus on manipulating the gametes. So manipulating the sperm or the egg. And those are going to prove to be, I think, more effective long term in terms of trying to address some of the safety concerns. Beyond that, I think we're going to get to questions about efficacy. And there you're really going to be looking at, what are you proposing to modify?
Hmm.
And is that trait or that characteristic the result of a single gene or not? And the minute you get beyond a single gene, you're really now looking at things that are going to be quite complicated because you have to manipulate a number of genes. And then on top of that, we'll go back to an earlier comment I made, which is that we are not just our genes. And the genes have to express themselves in some sense. And that's very much, in many cases, going to be dependent on the environment. So now we get to the interesting question of the environment, and many of us are concerned about the environment, increasingly so, and we talk about it as a crisis. So one of the things, in terms of, some would say, science fiction, certainly more than 30 years, is if you think about genome editing as a design project, if that's what it
Hmm.
ultimately is, what environment do you design for? And that's a very serious question. So in other words, if you're thinking of taking over the human evolutionary story, are you going to try and design what you think is the superhuman for this planet, which we're in the process of destroying, right? Or do you design this superhuman to live on another planet or in a spaceship or somewhere else? I mean, and the imagination can run wild. But the minute you engage in an intentional design project, you have to think both about the being you're designing and the environment in which that being needs to not only survive, but hopefully thrive. And so I think already there you can see how what's fascinating about this is the convergence of technology that's going to be very much a part of this project. And it won't just be the biological sciences, right? We're going to be thinking artificial intelligence. We're going to be thinking all kinds of other things that are going to be coming together. And for some people, that's quite frankly scary.
Your research is also focused on assisted reproductive technologies. Can you shine a light of what, in some countries I hear is also possible already? And maybe you wouldn't call that gene modification. I'm not sure what the terminology is, but where, a couple that is choosing to do IVF does have some options, right? To, make some choices of, which traits from which partner are being kind of considered.
So I think that's a really important question. So one of the things that's significant is that if we're just going back and talking about the genome editing and the design project, it does depend on a prior technology. It depends on in vitro fertilization. So it's not just about manipulating the human embryo in a dish in a lab. You then have to use all of that existing technology. So the point that I think you're raising is that we already have that technology and we have in fact already been using it. But the interesting and important thing is that most of those efforts have involved selection, not design. And so that's a point that I think is really important to underline, because we've been talking about designer babies for years. I would say to you, though, we've not actually had designer babies until quite recently. So let's talk about some of those technologies. The most basic of the technologies ultimately is choosing to use what gets referred to as donor sperm or donor gametes. And you could be doing that for a number of reasons. So your partner may have a particular underlying genetic condition that you're trying to avoid, and so you choose not to use their genetic material. Alternatively, you may be in a same-sex relationship, and so you need to again get donated genetic material. Or you may just want traits that are different from those of your partner, and so you're looking for donated genetic material. So that's the simplest of the selection processes. You select a different set of gametes to start with.
So could you to make it very banal, but could you today in the United States, for example, really choose the eye color of your baby by going for in vitro fertilization and picking maybe one color over the other of one of the partners?
So there are clinics that offer that technology, and it is restricted to about 3 eye colors because it has to do with the preponderance of what it is that you're going to be able to find when you do the genetic testing on those embryos. So yes, that's an example. But by and large, it's not yet that sophisticated. So what I mean by that is that you will get a catalog and you will get a description of the person who's providing the gametes, and you will get a picture. And in that description, you will learn about their physical traits and their attributes in terms of what you might or might not find aesthetically pleasing. You'll get information about their fitness. If they're an athlete, you'll get information about their mental health and their IQ. You'll get information about their genetic screening. And all of that information will be available to you on the basis of which you could be making choices. But you're then looking at a preponderance, or a possibility, because that genetic pool is being mixed with your genetic material. So there's 2 different ways of looking at it. There's the old-fashioned way. We do it on the basis of eyesight and other kinds of descriptions, which isn't very sophisticated, but it's what we've done for millennia. Or you start looking at the genetic material in the lab, and then you're asking questions about what can we test for. So yes, we can test for certain things like eye color. We can and do, however, tend to focus on what we anticipate will be underlying health challenges. And so in that context, what happens is you can look at the embryo and you can make a decision to say, these embryos are flawed. We will not transfer them. They will be discarded. These embryos are healthy. they will be transferred. So that's, again, I think, a really stark way of showing it's about selection. So
Yeah.
it's non-sophisticated selection based on a catalog, or it's higher sophistication based on genetic testing, which we call pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. But in a sense, that's different from the design. Now, let me just share with you, there's two ways in which we can do design. One of them is the genome editing. We take the genetic material and we use the CRISPR technology, which many people may have heard about. People talk about this as molecular scissors. And the idea is you go in and you cut the DNA and you either remove defective DNA or you add what you believe is a missing DNA or corrected DNA or selected DNA. And that's sort of the most recent of the attempts. That's the technology that was used with Dr. Jiankyu He in China in 2018. Prior to that, however, we have another genetic technology which also involves, I would say, design, and that is what's called mitochondrial donation. Now, I'll try and explain that as simply as I can. So imagine a chicken's egg. You've got the yolk, the yellow, and you've got the white. Well, in the human, you have the same thing. The yellow is what we call the nuclear DNA, and the white is what we call the mitochondrial DNA, or at least that's where it rests. It's not the mitochondrial DNA, that's where you find it. And the thing that's really important is that all humans have both kinds of DNA. You have nuclear DNA and you have mitochondrial DNA. Your nuclear DNA comes from both of your parents, and it's divided 50-50. Your mitochondrial DNA comes exclusively from your mother. And so the thing that's really important is it passes through the maternal line. So your mitochondrial DNA is the same as all of your siblings that come from that one genetic parent. Whether they're boy or girl, it doesn't matter. They will have the same mitochondrial DNA. And the same would be true for any person. If you were to reproduce, it would be all of the children would have the female partner's DNA. One of the things that we have seen and learned is that there are specific genetic diseases which are caused by the mitochondrial DNA. And so some scientists, in an effort to offer therapeutic interventions, said, well, let's replace the mitochondrial DNA. And that's what people started referring to as the 3-parent babies. And the reason for that is that the nucleus would have the DNA from the male and female partner, and then you would have a third person, another woman, genetically, if you will, inserted into the couple by providing the mitochondrial DNA. And there are children born of this technology as well. So those are designed. That's where what we've done is we have brought into the world a child that could not have existed but for that kind of intricate human hand changing the genetic makeup. In the other cases, yes, the human hand is involved, but it's only involved in selecting. You're picking this genetic material or you're picking that genetic material. And here you're saying, no, I'm looking at this genetic material and I'm going to change it. I'm going to modify it. I'm going to make it be the way I'd like it to be in order to give birth to a child that will have these traits. And the traits could be a plus or a minus. So I want to take away a trait that I think is harmful, or I want to add a trait that I think is beneficial. And that's the design project that we're just starting to embrace.
Wow, I mean, that is obviously a huge difference also, and you made it very visibly clear between selection and design. But from an ethical standpoint, how much of a difference does it make? Because even in a selection environment, and if you say we want a meritocracy and we want to make sure that we have an equal starting line for everybody, the selection process also takes that away, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think, the common thread is, and concern for many people has to do with eugenics. And I think that what we need to be thinking about then is who decides what's a good trait or a bad trait. And if we step back in time to even simpler technologies in terms of selection, it starts with when we first were able to get access to information about the developing fetus inside the woman. So up until this point, I've been talking about genetic material in a lab where we're looking at that genetic material. But prior to that, you would have the developing fetus inside a woman, and we started offering prenatal testing. And the two tests that people may have heard about are amniocentesis or chorionic villus sampling. And in either case, what you're trying to do is to get access to genetic information about the fetus in order to make decisions about the anticipated health of the newborn. And in some cases, on the basis of that information, women have chosen to have a termination of pregnancy. And so again, on the basis of traits that are perceived to be negative, a decision is made to terminate a pregnancy. Now, I think what becomes really controversial when you're able to start seeing the very legitimate concerns about eugenics is it started with a view of being able to identify fetuses that were thought to be at risk, for example, trisomy 21, commonly known as Down syndrome. And the idea was not to terminate these pregnancies, but to provide parents with information on the basis of which they could plan for the care and the support that might be needed for that child. And it did not take very long for this to transition away from that kind of, positive goal of providing support and care for both a family and a newborn to these were not going to be valued children, therefore these were not going to be pregnancies that would continue. And so what you've seen now is a huge response on the part of many with various kinds of challenges. But in this context, real claims of advocacy around the concept of neurodiversity to say there isn't just one way of being in the world that's right or best. And in fact, a number of people, have provided both, anecdotal and other empirical kind of evidence in support of these lives that are being terminated because people have particular views about what kind of life is worthwhile. So I think you're absolutely right. It doesn't matter whether we're talking selection or design if what you want to focus on is who gets to decide who lives or who dies, and by virtue of what. And I think that brings us to me to the big question that drives all of my work, whether it's on this topic or any other topic. And that is, what kind of world do we want to live in? We need the answer to that question in order to know what to do with any technology. And I think that's true even outside the life sciences. And so too often, my own view is that people working in bioethics stay focused on what's in front of them. Should we do this, whatever this technology is? And I'm saying that's not the right question. The question is, what kind of world do you want to build? What kind of world do you want to live in? And then when you've got that vision, then you come back and say, can this technology help me to build that world? And if it can't, then maybe you don't want to pursue that technology. And I know that kind of can sound really strange. What do you mean we wouldn't pursue a technology? But the fact of the matter is, time, talent, money, these are finite resources that are required to develop technology. And we have to re-examine the idea that all technology, just by virtue of being technology, is good and worthy of pursuit. And we need to be willing to start making choices about which technologies we're going to invest in because they help promote us getting to a place we want to be. And I think that too often we've been looking at, oh, this is a great tool, or this is really fun, or this is really exciting, or wow, I could do this. And it's the wrong starting point because you're starting with this technology that you think is really cool and really fun and might do something really wonderful. And I'm asking the world to stop and say, let's think about the world that we want. Is it a world that looks like this really cool thing, or is it something else? And can we work backwards from the larger vision of the world we want to live in?
What then would you say, I mean, before we get to kind of public policy, which I guess ultimately in these questions of technology, we also see it with, big tech and, the kind of implications it has had on democracy and, the kind of monopolistic behavior that it has kind of served, where, even the CEOs, make that argument of like, well, then regulators, but as long as you don't regulate us, I guess a company is almost like an organism, and it fights for survival, and it will maybe not think about the benefit of all of humankind and this like world that we want to live in, but it does think just more egoistically about itself as a company, but also I guess it applies to people. So I mean, can we as humans really everybody coming from kind of their own point of view? I mean, I was thinking about that question, like personally, I would probably be in favor to, regulate this space a lot more. But then, if it is not regulated and it is an option, will you forego doing it if you had the means to do so for the benefit of wider society because you actually opposed to it or not? So is this a decision that we can make for the common good, or are we doomed because ultimately our egoistic kind of Darwinistic, fight for individual survival goes above all?
I think that's a really hard question for me, largely because of recent experience with the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been doing a fair bit of reading and advocacy, writing, consulting around policy issues to do with this global crisis. And I have to say, I have been very disappointed by the choices that both governments and individuals have made, where they do not appear to have been able to truly understand and embrace the common good. Different governments are still acting as if viruses care about man-made borders. And I just don't know how to be more explicit in saying the virus could care less whether you're on this or that side of the border. And so if you're going to just try to develop policies that serve the interests of those who get to vote for you the next time around, you're ultimately never going to solve the problem. So witnessing that has been, I don't want to say depressing, but let's say sad. It's been sad. But for me, ultimately what that means is we have a whole lot more work to do in terms of really getting to this concept of the common good and understanding that that is not about geography. And then ultimately it is going to be understanding that that is not about capitalism as it is currently constructed. And I would go further, and I realize it's controversial to say that the same would be true with respect to democracy. These are concepts that we think are important. We have held on to them for a long time, at least in terms of recent history. And I think we actually need to challenge all of them in pursuit of this new way of understanding the common good. One of the things that I have been working on for a long time is the idea of consensus building. Many people think that I'm very Pollyannish and that this is impossible. And therefore, we need to be thinking in terms of what nation states can and will do within their borders, and then what kind of international agreements we can or cannot navigate. Well, we've had that happen just quite recently with COP26, and we haven't done very well there either. If your goal is the common good, we have actually failed, I would say. So we have two recent failures as far as I'm concerned. And that's quite distressing. But I think if we can name them as failures and can begin to understand what do those two failures have in common, and I would say at the end of the day, greed and stupidity. So if we can name that's our biggest problem right now, greed and stupidity, we may be able to eventually get some traction on something else. So what's the something else? I've been arguing for consensus building. Consensus building doesn't mean that we're going to get to unanimity. I think we have to accept and embrace the fact that we are diverse peoples. We have different views, values, different ways of understanding our place on this planet. And I don't think that we have to get to unanimity in order to make progress. What I think we do have to get to is unity, an understanding that we're all in this together. And that's what we haven't achieved with either the pandemic or climate crisis. We haven't actually really believed that we're all in this together. Why? Because some of us think we can buy our way out of it. And buying our way out of it might mean different things to different people, but they don't actually experience it as a common threat. It's a threat, but I won't live through it. And some of that will be on geography, and some of that will be on generations, right? So, oh, yeah, it'll probably happen, but I'll be dead by then. Or, yeah, it'll probably happen, but not in my part of the world. Or, yes, it'll probably happen, but I'm rich enough that I'll buy my way out of it. We have to get beyond that kind of thinking. And I think that the only way to do that is to commit to consensus building. Now, I know how to do that in small groups. Do I know how to do that for a planet? No. But if I wanted to say what kind of world do I want to live in and what kind of technology we should be developing, we need to develop far better technology that will in fact connect the world empathically. Not just can I see you, can I talk to you in real time, but what would it take for me to actually share the concerns that you have based on where you are in terms of your life trajectory, in terms of your cultural and political context? How can I make your problems be my problems as well? And the bottom line is we do so much research in basic science, in the life sciences, in artificial intelligence, and digital technology, et cetera. We don't even understand the human brain. We don't understand why we do or don't have sympathy or empathy for others. We don't see that as valuable research. What I'm arguing for is, can we invest in better understanding what makes for connections? And some people who do virtual reality are trying for that. But I have to say, what I've seen so far is not sufficiently sophisticated for empathy, but there's a whole cadre of people working in virtual reality to get you to be in that place, to understand and to emote for people who are under stress, whether it's climate stress, whether it's social stress, it doesn't matter. And what's important is, can we get to unity? And let me say one more thing about that. When people tell me that I'm foolish and that we can't do it, my response is, you know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe I am foolish. Maybe we can't get there. But boy, we'd already be very different if we tried. Trying will already change the world, right? I mean, if I genuinely committed to that project, I have to do two things. One of them, which is very threatening and which many people have not been willing to do, is to embrace humility. And that means what? There may be somebody smarter than me out there in the world, and they may actually know the answer to this problem. And if I spent my time believing that, I might actually listen a lot better. I might actually be genuinely interested in what people with other starting points have to say. Now, that may sound like it's very far away from some of the day-to-day work that I do around bioethical issues, whether it's genome editing, whether it's assisted reproductive technologies, whether it's COVID, et cetera. But it isn't if you go back to the fundamental view that I hold, which is that we can't make the world a better place unless we're busy investing in that vision and only thereafter turning to technologies to help us achieve that vision.
But is there an argument to be made, you would say, to just stop any progress on that front? Because it's almost like a Pandora's box we just don't want to open?
No, I don't think that that makes any sense to my way of processing the issue. And the reason is, if you commit to consensus building, one of the key ingredients is respect. It means that you're actually going to start from a point of respect for all peoples. And I think that that's something that's lacking. When we go into these multilateral negotiations and different countries are there, it doesn't actually start from a place of trust or respect, which is why when the negotiations happen, you actually don't get where you need to in terms of the common good, because people are still protecting their interests. And why are they protecting their interests? Because they rightfully believe that somebody else out there doesn't have their interests at heart. So if they don't protect their interests, nobody will. But genuine consensus building, people actually move through trust, through respect, to actually get to the common good, because you then understand and believe I don't have to be so protective of my interests because everyone is looking out for my interests because my interests are in common with yours. And so you get to a point where actually you can get a collapse eventually of self-interest and other interests because you begin to understand they're one and the same. And I genuinely believe what I'm articulating now, specific to the work that I've done and that I write about in my book, Altered Inheritance, which is about genome editing, it's the same thing that I'd be advocating for climate change. It's the same thing that I'd be advocating for the pandemic. It's all about getting to where we want to be means you have to actually understand and invest where you want to be. And right now, we don't do that. It's all like, well, we don't like where we are. So we don't like where we are vis-a-vis the climate crisis. We don't like where we are vis-a-vis COVID. We don't like where we are with respect to certain kinds of scientific endeavors, but we don't have a common goal of what we want the future to look like. That's still quite dispersed.
And is it so that the current conversations, I assume, or the current kind of policy, thinking is around like competitiveness as a nation state, correct? And it is about not losing out on the next big industry. That's obviously the wrong thing to think about, I would assume. Do you see from your conversations that you have with scientists around the world, like, frustration in the sense that, it's being hijacked again, for purely economic reasons?
I think that certainly there are a number of people that are very frustrated when they see science that was in pursuit of a common goal really ending up sort of in huge patent disputes, where when you calculate the money that's been spent on the patent dispute, which is supposed to be a fraction of what the actual discovery is going to be worth, and you think, what could have been done with that money that would have made for a better world for how many more people? And I think, there are many philosophers that work on this. And, specifically, I'm thinking now of Peter Singer, who does a lot of work around the lives we could save if we were to actually invest our time and talent in other kinds of projects. And I think for me, what becomes critically important is, can we get to that place where we're driven not by competition, but by collaborative ambition? And so people say to me, what is that collaborative ambition? I think it's an effort to embrace the idea that you don't want to get rid of ambition. You want people to be looking for the next great invention. You want people to be pursuing novel ideas. You want progress. You want innovation. These are not bad words. But the thing is, can you do it in a way where you're actually looking to collaborate with the idea that if you do that, you'll actually get where you want to go more quickly? And chances are you'll waste less time on, in French we say, false pistes, false pathways. Because what happens right now, we have a lot of duplication of effort. We have lots of science that's done that gives negative results. We don't publish that science, so we don't know. And so people do it again. So you get a lot of wasted effort. There are many ways in which we could redesign the science enterprise. We could redesign the publication practices around the generation of new knowledge to actually make sure that knowledge is shared more efficiently. And I think what we need is not a framework of competition, because competition has given us the world that we have currently with respect to those kinds of practices, with respect to science, where we don't share generously, but that we can try to reframe it in terms of collaborative ambition. And I think that that's something we need to move towards.
And it seems to me, it reminds me a little bit also about the climate crisis, in the sense that ultimately, as much as we can do on an individual level in the climate crisis, it requires really political will and political power to make those changes that are necessary for a better world for all of us. And there is now increasing demand of people, and we see it with the parties, the Green parties winning traction in Europe. We see it with the demonstrations, Fridays for Futures, etc., that, this crisis has gotten kind of the main street support and demand, which is so crucially important. With this topic, around gene technology, gene editing, and, the possible paths this could take, I personally don't see any of it. I don't see this really being discussed kind of in the wide open public square. Is that your thinking also? And what should the narrative be? Like, how can we get, more people interested in the subject matter?
So let me respond to your comments from two different perspectives. So one of the things I want to say with respect to the first set of remarks is I actually don't believe it's just about political will. And the reason, I think there is not political will. So I agree there.
Yeah.
But I think the real problem is the 1%. Because the 1% increasingly is actually controlling what is happening in terms of politics. And that's why I said earlier on, we actually have to be willing to interrogate democracy and how we understand that concept and how it can work in a world that has social media with all of its failings and strengths, how it can work in a world where the power differential by virtue of economics is so skewed that you actually have people who are not elected truly running the country, because it's the business interests that are ultimately forcing democratically elected people to move in one direction or another. So I think that that's one of our first problems. We don't have political will, but we need to ask ourselves why we don't have political will, especially if the people want something different than what the politicians are doing. And I think we really need to interrogate that. So that's the first thing, that I wanted to speak to. I think the second thing about, why are we not seeing this issue in the public domain the way we have, for example, recently with pro and con perspectives, both with respect to climate and the pandemic, is that because a lot of this science is happening behind closed doors. And it only burbles up every now and then when there's a crisis of some kind, as happened in 2018, when the scientist announced that he had created 2 genetically modified children. Well, then it makes headlines. But it hasn't made headlines since then. And I can assure you, it's not because all of a sudden everybody who was working in that area has closed their labs, right? So the science is continuing. And in that context, a number of high-level, both international and professional organizations have been meeting to try and address something that you spoke of before. How can we get some kind of regulatory framework for that? So very recently, I was a member of the WHO committee that looked at the issue of governance of human genome editing technology. We issued a report in July of this year, and in that context made a number of very specific recommendations looking at tools and mechanisms that governments could use in order to regulate in this space. But it's not clear to me that it has yet reached a tipping point in the minds of the general public. Now, why? Lots of reasons, and I'll just give you one. If you're a person living in poverty, trying to ensure that you can feed your children, if I come and talk to you about something as sophisticated as taking over the human evolutionary story, you might say to me, I'm really busy. I have other things to worry about right now, and I'm not going to get to that for a very long time, if ever, right? I have real world constraints. Now, for me, in the context of the work I do, what I am trying to say to people is, I totally get that. And yes, you have to put your energy into feeding your children right now. But at some point, you do have to worry about the world that those children are going to grow up into. And that's why you now see the concerns about climate, because people are starting to worry about the next generation and what are we leaving them? What is the environment in which they're going to have to try to both survive and strive? And so in that case, what needs to happen is you need to actually, again, help people to exercise the moral imagination and understand that, and in future generations, these are the challenges that your children and your children's children are going to face. And the hard part is, because of the nature of those changes, it's like asking people to have made decisions about the climate 200 years ago, because you were trying to say 200 years ago, you're on a pathway and you're going to end up in a dangerous, contentious place. That's where we are now. And people like myself are trying to say, we have the same phenomena now, we're just further back in the fork in the road. And if you take this fork without thinking through where you're going, you could end up in a place that you don't want to be, which is where we are today. We are in a place that we don't want to be, but it's not because of a decision we made this year or last year or 10 years ago. It's because of decisions made 100 and 150 years ago in terms of industrialization, in terms of air travel, in terms of all kinds of things. And so again, if you can get people to start changing the way they think about technology writ large, it's not about today and it's not about this cool science. It's about what kind of world are you trying to build, and how will this technology either help to build that world or ultimately compromise it.
Two last questions, Francoise. This has been fascinating, but I'm getting to the end of our conversation. And one question we ask everybody who's on the show is around, this concept of pivoting and iteration. And in the startup technology world, there's the so-called finding market fit, product market fit methodology, where you're iterating on your product until you find that fit. And if you don't, you pivot and you really go down a very different product angle and direction. And I wonder, whether in the science world and, the research that you do, you also often come to this point where you're like, well, should we iterate and you do kind of small, incremental changes on our approach, or should we really think about it in a totally different step function type of way? And I wonder, whether you, approach these type of situations and how. Like, are there any mental models, frameworks? Who do you talk to? Like, how do you go about making that decision whether to keep going or actually change course?
Well, probably because I'm not creative enough. I'm committed to small incremental changes in terms of trying to get people to embrace the sort of question I'm asking them to embrace. So it's through small interactions with sometimes, grassroots organizations, civil society, sometimes with, politicians and people with, a little bit more power in terms of how we think about regulating the world. But it's incremental in terms of getting them to understand I'm advocating for a different frame. But the frame is a lot more, right? Like, that's not an incremental change. That's a radical shift. And one of the things I use in my public speaking is I have an image from Alice in Wonderland. And Alice stops at a fork in the road and she looks to the cat and says, "Which way should I go?" And the cat says, "Well, where are you trying to get to?" And Alice says, "Well, I don't know." And then the cat says, "Well, then it doesn't matter." Right? Because I have no basis on which to tell you, take the road on the right or the left. So what I'm really trying to do is I said, no, I'm actually going to give you a direction. The direction is, I'm saying to the cat, if I'm Alice, I want to get to a better world where we're committed to the common good. And it's then lots of people can help me, because then they can say, oh, well, if that's what you're trying to do, then you need this technology, or you need to walk away from that technology, right? And I think that that's what becomes really important. And I just think we haven't done that. We've really focused on, hey, look, we can make batteries. Isn't that cool? We could put them in cars. Great. You know what? They could actually be for a house. Let's build batteries for houses. And where are you going to dispose of these batteries afterwards? Oh, well, the next generation will figure that one out. And I think that we've done a lot of that with technology. We've answered one problem with a technological fix for that moment in time, without understanding that we've perhaps created a problem for another generation. And then we just have hubris. Well, they'll fix it. Just like we fix this problem, they'll fix the next problem. And I'm asking us to think generations down the road, what kind of world are we trying to build, so that we make different decisions today, so that our progeny, our descendants, aren't dealing with problems that we could have anticipated if we exercised our moral imagination.
Thank you so much, Francoise. Finally, then, you already made one literal reference with Alice in Wonderland. Is there any science fiction in your reading, or movies that you like, or are you have enough science fiction in your daily life?
Well, you asked the question a couple of days after I watched Dune, which is a very interesting commentary on, I think, climate and choices that have been made and challenges that we now have, and questions of competition and questions of alliances, and why we think that we can just rape this planet and not have to suffer as a result of poor choices along the way. I think that, we really need to interrogate that. And if I can come back to a point I made before about humility and hubris, one of the things we don't do very well is turn to others who think about the world very differently in terms of their starting points. And one of the things I constantly learn from are our indigenous peoples, no matter where they are on this planet. They have in common a different understanding of their place in the world, a different understanding of their relationship to the planet, and a different kind of view about caretaking. And, one person that I had the pleasure of meeting and having some interesting conversations with respect to my views about capitalism and democracy, et cetera, said something very powerful to me. In our community, we measure wealth not by how much you can accumulate, but by how much you can afford to give away. Now that's just a complete shift, right? I would be very wealthy and judged to be wealthy by what I can give away, not by what I can amass and what I can spend it on. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for creative ways of thinking that make you stop in your tracks and say, wow, what if we organize the world around that idea instead of the one we currently have? And so I think that, for me, if we really want to make progress, we need a lot more humility. We need to talk to a lot more people, and we need technology to help us learn how to do that and how to better understand the human brain.
We leave it at that. Thank you so much, Francoise. This has been a really inspiring conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for great questions, which took me in a whole bunch of interesting directions. Appreciate it.